Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Faith Unraveled. Today, we're going to be talking about why we do
what we do
with our ex-Mormon content.
Because it's not easy, right? Like what we are doing, we automatically cause ourselves to be
shat upon.
Yeah, by many different people.
Passers-by.
But we also have lost probably friendships from being vocal on the church, right? And even family members have struggled with it in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So.
Why would we do this to ourselves?
Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and talk about how that got started. I did cover this a little bit in my episode with Margie and John, talking about how I got started on Ex-Mormon TikTok. And the most abbreviated version of that is that back in about 2011, our stake president asked us to start shining our light online. So I started a blog. And after a little while, the blog took off and ended up in a big community on Facebook. And Jamie just said to me one day, you know, you did musical theater in high school. Have you ever thought about making videos? And I just thought the idea of putting my face on camera and then putting it online just sounded utterly bizarre. But I thought it would be cool to do it in an interview format.
And this was like 2016, 2017.
Yeah, it was 2016 from my memory. Yeah. So I had started blogging in 2011, but in 2016, I was like still totally active member. In fact, my blog was, it was like a nutritional program that to me was consistent with the word of wisdom. It was a scripture reading schedule. And then it was like ways that you can be a better mom. Like it was like I was a trad wife, babe.
I don't know what to say about that.
He's like, I didn't ask for it.
Not at all.
But it is true. So I started making this online content mostly by like interviewing doctors to get their tips and tricks on like dialing in your nutrition and kind of the whole biohacking sphere. I still actually love that, but I have a different lens for it now. It made for a very natural progression into making ex-Mormon content because when I deconstructed in 2019, as I was preparing myself to become a seminary teacher, the first thought that I had was, I can't believe how uninformed I was. Like that was the first thought. Like as members of the church, we are incredibly uninformed because we are given materials to read from, and we're really not supposed to venture beyond those materials. That was my experience. I was asked as a Relief Society teacher to not go outside of the correlated materials.
Yeah, when we first got married, we taught Sunday school, the 13 and 14-year-olds. And I felt like the lessons that we read out of the manual were so boring that we started like doing our own types of lessons. I wonder what the Sunday school president thought about us during that period of time. So
that was before the internet though.
Yeah.
So I feel like that was not a big deal.
Yeah.
But if you went back into like old correlated materials, like when we first got married, Jamie got called as like Sunday school president of the ward. And one day he was like, I want to go clean, I want to clean up my cupboards. So he went to the Sunday school cupboard and he's just taking boatloads of manuals out.
It had manuals from like 1960s, 1970s. I mean, those cupboards had not been cleaned for many, many years. And this is like in the early 2000s.
And the church doesn't want you using those old manuals because they're going to have quotes from like Bruce McConkie.
Well, at the time, I didn't realize. I get it now why they don't want it, because there's controversial topics
and contradicting statements.
Yeah.
Very contradicting, like things that were said back then that were the reasons for people having a darker pigmentation, like
or caffeine. Remember,
extremely racist, or even talking about the word of wisdom.
Yeah,
and old school
you
approach
had old prophets that would say that drinking caffeine is bad. So this is the reason why I believe BYU and the MTC never had like Coke or Pepsi or anything like that, because
they do now.
I know, but it was at the time it was against like what the prophet's direction was.
Yeah, yeah. So we had this experience of going through the manuals in the Sunday school closet, and I grabbed a bunch of them and took them home because I thought, I wasn't raised in a super Orthodox household. So there's a lot of this that I'm still learning. I want to learn about church history. I want to learn about the Old Testament, Doctrine and Covenants, and dig into that. When I woke up to my faith crisis, what I realized is that the church had curated the materials that I was allowed to see in order to paint their narrative. And that narrative has changed with time. If you go back and see what was originally written about the accounts of the first vision, they're very different than the story that we were taught in the 80s and 90s growing up in the church. If you look at the narrative around the priesthood restoration, the Book of Abraham translation, so many things. Name any major pillar of belief within Mormonism, and I'm going to argue that it has been reconfigured to some degree to match up with a particular narrative. Do you think that's an overstatement?
To match up to where society is today. Like
Also, yes.
Yeah, where the church is always behind, I believe.
Yeah.
And it has to match up their narrative to where society is today. And where society is today, it's the information age. And so all this information has come out very different than what we were taught in the narrative we were taught when we were kids. And so now the church has to change its narrative or figure out how to reconfigure it or adopt the information that's out there now. In the past, they would just deny it.
Yeah. They would also excommunicate historians who were faithfully trying to make sense of this information. But can you imagine being a church historian, you're church employed, you're coming across information that is contradictory to the church's presentation of these historical events, and you're just trying to proceed as a historian, which means that the evidence speaks for itself. And there were people excommunicated for that. So,
well, I think it's fascinating that the church historian today is an attorney.
The church historian is an attorney?
Yeah, it's not that they've done biblical scholarship at Oxford or Harvard around all this information or been to BYU and did the religious studies. They prefer to look at attorneys versus them. And partially, I think, is because the narrative is so far off from where they had presented in the past. And so they need these attorneys to help guide them.
Attorneys are trained on how to present a story.
Well, they manage risk.
They manage risks, but also an attorney knows how to present the evidence in a way that's going to favor a certain narrative, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they also help keep the church out of trouble too and make sure that they're saying the right things, especially when the narrative was contradictory. And to me, it just shows you that they have a problem when they're putting an attorney and a church historian. When they have BYU who does religious studies. They have people who go all in on the Book of Mormon and start learning everything about the Book of Mormon. Hugh Nibley's one of them. We have friends who were part of that. They have the CS path to where you're learning all about the church and the church education system. And they don't pull these guys forward and put them in this role. They put attorneys. And I think the attorneys have been there for the last 3-4 years or 3-4 times or whatever the rotations they have. So
yeah, I'm wearing the cutest bracelet and I just kind of want it to make an appearance in the episode. Okay. Did I say that was going to be the abbreviated version? I feel like I kind of gave the longest possible version.
That's fine. I think it's good.
But so I'm in this rabbit hole. I'm realizing that the information that I have been taught is not reflective of the actual occurrences. And I am devastated and I'm feeling the devastation in my body. I'm feeling that sensation that God has left the room. I'm seeing my life flash before my eyes. And I pulled up an episode of Mormon Stories podcast, not purposefully. Mind you, I had come across John's podcast years before when I was looking for a faithful podcast to listen to. And I would always come upon it and I would hear the "Come, come, ye saints." Do you remember that old intro that he used to have? And I was like, oh, this is the anti one. And I would switch out of it to go to the All In podcast. I loved that one. I listened to the All In podcast literally till the day that I deconstructed. Anyway, but I just typed in CES letter, making sense, faith crisis, and an episode from John pops up. And it just so happens that it's the episode from Donna Showalter, who is sharing her experience as a stake young women's president whose son has come out of the closet. She has this faith crisis and she realizes how many children have been victims of suicide because of the church's stance on LGBTQIA plus people. And that was the moment that I shifted from being really sad for myself because I was told lies and I felt that my life was partly imaginary, like what I believed was true wasn't true, immediately to shifting into this not being informed has serious consequences. There's people that have lost their life because of this doctrine, because they believed that it was better to be dead than to be gay. And they're doing this based on their belief that the church is true. And once I saw that, I couldn't keep quiet. And I started by kind of trying to get onto Facebook and just having discussions in the comments and things like that. But as soon as I found Ex-Mormon TikTok, which was very small, there were only maybe a couple dozen accounts, maybe. I just realized I got to open my camera and start talking about this.
Well, and we talked about this. You got reported to the stake president when you went on Facebook and shared the CS letter. And we had the bishop come into our home to talk with us about that situation. And so at that point in time, you also backed off of social media for a bit and was trying to figure out where do you go? with this. And eventually you began making TikTok content.
Yeah, I just couldn't stay quiet. The way that Donna describes the carnage, that there was like an uptick in unalivings after the 2015 LGBTQIA plus policy, which did not allow children of gay people to be baptized. I mean, we had friends at the time who were gay and had children that were active in the church. And if you think about how crazy that is, there isn't a policy like that for like a mass murder. Like children of mass murderers can't get baptized. Children of child sex offenders, children of KKK members, but children of LGBTQIA plus people can't get baptized. Like it's so devastating to think about that. And for Donna, it was figuring out how to make sense of that just terrible policy and then watching it flip back after the reaction of the public. And perhaps the church saw the uptick in suicides.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was, but she was just like, did God change his mind? Like, there is blood on your hands.
So the harm was the main, like one of the main.
It was like, you've lied to us, and I'm pissed about that, but these lies have consequences. To hear people who grew up in the church before the 1978 priesthood ban was lifted, they had to sit outside of their priesthood meetings. They couldn't be sealed as a family. They paid tithing even though they couldn't have the blessings of the temple. It was just so damaging. And to hear people of color talk about thinking that they would maybe become more fair as they were more obedient, that was taught in Sunday school lessons in the church. And it didn't impact us because we're white. And so we missed it. We completely missed it. And when you see that and you see that kind of damage, you realize I participated in this system. I perpetuated this system. You just really have this need to speak out.
I started becoming outspoken. I saw Sam Young speak in Thrive at St. George. I think this was in 2022.
And Sam was a bishop, and he was made aware that his 12-year-old daughter was asked about masturbation.
And she didn't even know what it was.
She didn't know what it was.
She learned in the bishop's office what masturbation was.
And went home and looked it up.
Yeah.
And this is all without his consent as a parent, because in Mormonism, it's like a regular acceptable practice to let children go into a bishop's office and talk about chastity.
Yeah. And so he became vocal against the church in doing this, and they ended up excommunicating him. That's this crazy thing. They excommunicated him for not wanting to have his children ask questions about sex. And after that, it did change. After he got excommunicated, the policy did change where a parent can go into a bishop's interview. In the past, there was no parents in the bishop's interview. It's all confidence. And you get some crazy bishops that would ask some crazy questions, and you feel very uncomfortable. Both of us went through disciplinary councils as like teenagers. So it's not a fun experience. And so for me, after I saw that and him explaining his experience, he talked about advocation and how important it is to advocate. And so at that point in time, you could probably even look at my Facebook to see, like, that's when I started like coming forward with like the harm the church does around like racism and LGBT, because I saw it too. Alicia was getting messages from teenagers about how they just felt hopeless in their families, and that they're LGBT, and they just felt like they couldn't like be themselves and authentic. And there was times where you got messages about how they were the suicidal ideation that they would go through as part of that. And so, being an advocate and vocalizing some of this was more just like, I had done so much damage in the past being in the church. I wanted to do something to advocate outside of the church. So, and I'm not advocating to harm the members at all. I'm advocating for transparency. That's what I'm advocating for. I want the church to be transparent. I want them to understand the harm they're doing and really think about their policies.
Part of being vocal about the church for me has been sharing the true historical narrative, the one that existed first.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because I think that sometimes as members of the church, we get so wrapped up in the feelings of the experience of going to church, the feelings and emotions of having an answered prayer, the feelings and emotions of having a spiritual experience, because they're everywhere in the church, and separating that from what we actually believe. So one Instagram influencer that just happened to leave the church, and she's talked a little bit about it, Sasha Piton, she did a snippet where she just said, I just realized I don't actually believe it. And that's the thing. We get so wrapped up in the community, we get so wrapped up in the feeling of Mormonism that we don't realize what we are sacrificing for. And if we actually look at the core of it and we see that Joseph Smith was actually very persuasive and he coerced young girls to marry him, then we can start to paint the picture of like, maybe this isn't actually Christ's church. And like, if you really evaluate where the church is today, it's pretty obvious. It's not a church that Jesus would put his name on.
For me, it's more about life decisions I made. I made a number of life decisions the last 40 years based upon a narrative that was completely false.
Right. Because you're willing to make sacrifices for something that's true.
Mm-hmm.
But are you willing to make sacrifices for a lie?
And so I feel like part of this is also exposing those lies and bringing out the truth. Most of my friends who are on Facebook, or they won't even listen to it, or they call me anti now. Like I've had multiple people like, Jamie is anti, and I've had a couple members who have stepped in and also supported me and said, no, Jamie's not anti. He's just sharing the truth of what the church is. And so I appreciated the people that could hold space for me and even defend me in those comments.
Because the reality is there are people who deconstruct and continue to go to church. Not everybody that deconstructs leaves. Some people stay in and they're still members and they're like, I want to call myself Mormon. I want to participate in this. I want to do these things with my kids, and this was my heritage and I'm passing it on. Some of them have deconstructed though. And so they're viewing it through a very different lens.
Yeah. Or they've gone through the deconstruction and still believe too. So
that's true.
The few that were defending me were still believers, but they had gone down the rabbit hole to a certain extent and then come back up and said, no, I still believe. And so I appreciated that very much. But most members don't know the history of their church. They don't know like Alicia talked about, the polygamy, the banking crisis. I mean, Bernie Madoff is no different than what Joseph Smith did back in the day and taking money from it. And it's constant. Like it's to the looking glass, looking into the rock and the hat and coming up with scriptures. I tell you, if I knew, like I had always been taught that they'd open the golden plates. He translated behind a sheet to Oliver Cowdery or Emma, and they translated based upon the Urim and Thummim.
The allegory that I've had in my head lately is that the church is like a pond, and you think it's the pond of everlasting life. And so you're in the pond, you're drinking the water, you're giving the water to your children. But little by little, people are noticing that they're getting sick, and some are getting more sick than others. And for the individuals that like this water is like literally poisoning them, and they try to leave, but their parents think that the best thing that they can do for them is to get them back in the water and give them more water. And in some cases, that's fatal.
Yeah.
And that's why I am doing this, because I want people to know what's in the water. And
I'm fine if they know the water is poisonous and they stay in the water.
They want to do it for themselves.
Yeah, that's totally fine. But then once they start influencing their kids or other people around them and make them drink from that toxicity, then it becomes harmful for them. And we have lost people because of that.
Yeah. And unfortunately, showing people the statistics of like suicides doesn't actually do it, because if you really believe in the gospel, you have an eternal perspective that tells you that this life is short and that they're going to see them in the next life. And that's one of the most painful parts of experiencing a funeral, is realizing that what's giving these parents hope is actually what arguably created the situation in the first place. And so for us, that is a reason big enough to lose friendships and to lose family relationships, because it is that serious to us. So like we try to be lighthearted about some of it. Some of it's funny, like talking about the gods in the next life or having multiple wives in the next life, which was clearly what Joseph Smith believed and taught. That
or the CTR totem that we raised for.
We went to a rave with a totem that had the CTR emblem on it that said "Choose the rave." And it's like
gave out CTR rings to people.
And it seems so. Yeah, one of our
non-member.
One of their never Mormon rave family members brought CTR rings for everybody. Like it was so great. And like honestly, you have to be able to have some levity, some laughter,
because the harm itself could be overwhelming for people.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. For us, that's why we're willing to do it. And it's and kind of shitty at times when you show up places that people don't want you there, because the thing that's most sacred to them is the thing that you are speaking out against.
Or not get invited. We've talked about this in the past. Like we have life events for our family members that we don't get invited to, because I don't think they, my belief is because we're so vocal, they're a little bit concerned about us.
I just want to clarify that I'm not getting emotional because of the loss of those friendships.
No.
Even though that is sad, I would be willing to do that over and over and over again to drill home that the well is poisoned.
For some people. Do you think the well's poison for all people?
I do. I think that information is critical. So I believe in the informed part.
But at one point in time, you talked about the church having an energy level that was higher than some of the people that were there, that it does like provide some goodness. Do you not believe that at all anymore?
I feel like I've never been able to quite explain it in a way that is understandable. But basically, during my first mushroom journey, I saw this experience of people sitting in the pews at church, and they felt comfort by the fact that their brokenness that they'd been taught by the church was being corrected by the church every week, going back for that sacrament. That was the best thing all week that they had experienced because they're living in a box. And to go and take the sacrament every week felt nourishing to them. It felt good to them. And it was the most like comforting thing that they had done all week. And I just thought, how sad is that? It's like being in an abusive situation where someone is telling you that you are not good enough, only to then step in and say, oh, but I have what's going to make you better. So I'm not saying that I think it would be better to actually step outside of that and to see that like you don't have to live in that box. There's actually a lot of beauty outside of it. But I know that that's not the best experience for everybody. Some people really become destabilized leaving the church. Yeah. So I think everybody has...
I go back and forth. I go back and forth where I think for some people, the church is good for them. And for others, it's toxic and very harmful. But then I see they're stuck in that box or stuck in that pond. Other reason I think you have been vocal to is you had a mom who deconstructed alone.
Before me and alone.
Alone for over 20 years. Like I think it was 30 years that she deconstructed, and you could tell there was something off with her testimony. And she knew this stuff in the early 90s.
I just always felt like she was grumpy about the church. I didn't realize that she had fully deconstructed and was just chemo in order to like keep me happy, and didn't want to disappoint her parents, didn't want to disappoint her siblings and her children.
And so she stayed in that pond
for a long time.
Yeah, to make everybody else happy around. And so that's the other, I think, reason that you are vocal is to give people a place to where they can deconstruct safely.
Yeah, I really see you, PMOs. I really, really, really do. So many PMOs, physically and mentally out. That's what PMO stands for. Yeah. So anyway, do you have anything else you want to add to today's episode? We could probably do a lot more episodes on why we do what we do. But for today, that will be it. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please let us know in the comments. And if you're listening on podcast, please consider writing us a review. We love connecting with you on social media as well. So find us on Faith Unraveled Instagram and send us a DM if you would like to suggest an episode topic. If there are things around deconstruction or new life or anything pertaining, it can be funny, it can be ridiculous, it can be serious. Send us your ideas. We'll see you guys next time.